The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome to Getting to Know You. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're going to be talking about archaeology, but archaeology right here in Albany, New York. This summer we had the historic Albany Archaeology Field School. They were working down at the Tenbrook Mansion and the Myers residence, which is part of the Underground Railroad History Project. So we have with us Marilyn Masson, is that right?
Sure.
She's from SUNY Albany, and you're from the Anthropology Department.
Yes.
An archaeologist. Paul Stewart, he's from the Underground Railroad History Project. Mike Lucas from the New York State Museum. So welcome. Thanks for coming. Mm-hmm. So why don't we start with the field school. It's been how many years have you been doing this? I'm sorry, it's the first time you're working in Albany. Explain the field school.
Well, Albany often has an archaeology field school in the summer. Up before last year, it was on a prehistoric site out in the Schoharie Valley, but in 2017 we started the historical archaeology field school to investigate the 19th century in Albany.
So your field is Mesoamerica. How did it feel to just go down the street and work in Albany? It
was amazing. I really enjoyed it, especially the opportunity to engage with the public and with the Underground Railroad History Project.
And then, Paul, the Underground Railroad, I think we all know what that is, but the Underground Railroad History Project right here in Albany at the Myers House, what is that organization?
Well, as much as we'd like to think we know what the Underground Railroad is, it tends to have a little bit different texture when you start looking at it really hard, and that's what we try to do is get a deeper sense of what the story is. But the Underground Railroad History Project is a nonprofit organization. It's made up of probably 450 member contributors. It's a typical nonprofit, has a board of directors. We try to re-examine the story of the Underground Railroad, starting with its story here in Albany. And we particularly like to take a look at what the African American participation in the story was, not just as the passengers, but also as the conductors, if you will.
And one thing that piqued my interest, you write here the Underground Railroad movements with an S. When you think history.
Right. We use that word Underground Railroad movement because I think a lot of times people overlook the fact that there's a definition that often has been used of the Underground Railroad, a string of safe houses that slaves used to get freedom in Canada. Mm-hmm. But the story is a little bit broader than that because that string of safe houses had circles of people that supported those entities. They had newspapers, rallies. There were lots of other things. Not everybody who was an abolitionist was a supporter of the Underground Railroad, and not everybody who was in the Underground Railroad would have been considered necessarily part of the abolitionist movement. But it's there are complexities, and we like to get into the complexities.
And also, just from reading this, is it safe to say the Underground Railroad movement is like a precursor to some later movements?
It is, in a sense, one of the earliest civil rights movement. There are lots of features of that, but I mean, it's certainly a precursor of the present civil rights movement that we've seen in the past 50 years.
And Mike, that from the New York State Museum, your part in this, if you could explain.
Yeah, so I'm the curator of historical archaeology at the museum. So the museum has had a cooperative a program with the University of Albany and doing an archaeological field school. So this year, this last year it was in historical archaeology, so that's my area of expertise. So I came onto the project to help with what was going on.
So Marilyn, how did you get together to pick? You said you worked in Schoharie before. Why did you pick Albany and this particular well, you can show some artifacts in a
Okay.
second.
Sure. Well, previous to me, it was Professor Sean Rafferty, who worked in the Schoharie Valley, but I just wanted to work locally. It turns out that my work in Mexico is on the peripheral of Spanish arrival. So I'm already interested in the colonial period and history, the different kinds of data you get from history
Okay.
and archaeology. So Matt Kirk is a grad student at the University of Albany, and he'd already been running archaeology programs, small ones, at the Tenbrook Mansion and the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. So I spoke to Matt, and he recommended these places for a field school.
Now, I saw a little clip of one of the students, and he said something like, we found objects all over the place. So we want to talk about a couple and then explain how you, I don't know, there's several layers of, I think you were dealing with different eras, weren't you? Or
Well, yes, this is our first year, so we wanted to understand the deposits and then their ages, and whether we had fill or whether we had intact refuse zones. Our real goal was to reconstruct daily life, consumer habits, preferences, degrees of wealth, and the best way to do that is to count up and analyze people's garbage.
so could you say this is sort of the history that's not in the history books?
Exactly, the daily life.
So I see one of the things you had there you were talking about before we started. Professor somebody's liver. Explain that. Could you explain that one, or you could hold that one up and talk about it?
Okay. Well, this is Dr. Kilmer's, and I want him to read it so I get it right. Swamp root kidney cure, made in Binghamton, New York. So, Michael, you probably know more about the context of this.
Well, I don't know that
object.
one in particular, but it's probably a good bit of alcohol in that.
Okay.
These were, they had various remedies in the late 19th century, that I guess in the popular media you think of medicine shows and so on. And so there were a lot of people peddling this kind of cure-all. If you read the description of something like this, it would have cured everything from, sore feet to liver disease or something. So it's typical for the late 19th century, and that's probably a post-1870s bottle.
Okay. So, Paul, you've been down you started the Underground Railroad History Project, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think 17 years ago at this point. Yeah.
From all these, from the other digs, and for this summer, what are some of the things you've learned about the Myers house as a stop on the Underground?
Well, one of the things about Stephen and Harriet Myers is we do know that Stephen worked in various professions related to food service, food organizing, being a steward, head waiter, those sorts of things. And what I don't think we had a deep appreciation of was where that work fit in within the range of work possibilities for African Americans and for people in general in society. And so, although he does not have an executive job in the sense of owning the restaurant, he has a very good job in terms of the work that he was able to provide for his family. And so we find some amazing stuff in this archaeological collection here. And also in the home itself. He was a tenant in the building. The building, according to the records that we have been able to find, was owned by John Johnson, who was his brother-in-law. But John Johnson seems to be doing rather well for himself to build this townhouse. John Johnson was a ship captain. He owned probably a sloop on the Hudson River and was involved in shipping. And so he seemed to make a good living and was able to provide this building, which his brother-in-law Stephen and his sister Harriet, lived in for a short time in the mid-1850s.
Oh, okay. So, Marilyn, when you start on a project like this, how many students did you have?
We had 9 students.
9 students. So,
yes.
what is like the first step? you could.
Well, the first step is to teach them how you decide where to dig. We take them from the beginning through the techniques of excavation, mapping, recording information, photography, and so on. And so we were using historical maps at Tenbrook and at the Myers house, which showed perishable outbuildings to the rear of the houses. And these were likely places at Tenbrook where enslaved persons might have worked and lived in the summer. And at the Myers residence, they were probably activity areas that might have housed privies or cisterns, as the case may be.
So the house, the outhouse, or no, not the, what was the term? Not outhouse. The
Outbuilding.
outbuilding. I'm sorry.
Not yes.
They're not still standing, are they?
No, they're not. Although one at Tenbrook, the floor foundations might still be there. So we have drawings on old maps, and that guided our decisions of where to build. We thought they would be hubs for activity areas.
So what were the students, what was their level of enthusiasm? What did you find that they...
It was one of the best groups I've ever had. I've taken students to, Mexico many times and Belize, but they were really genuinely interested in history and history of Albany, and that was heartening. Their enthusiasm was contagious for the rest of us.
And Mike, were you down over the summer during this?
Yeah, and most of the time I was able to come down and help and teach. That's part of that's the biggest part of what we were doing. We were providing an avenue for young people to learn what archaeology is about. It's not just about digging up things. It's about understanding their relationship, how old they are. There's a process of doing archaeology, but also the meaning of that collection of things, and then to help and partner with organizations, outside organizations, that can really use this material for public outreach.
So, Mike, I have a question that any of you can answer. It seems like in the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, studying everyday life seems to be becoming more important into history than when I was growing up. What can we learn from studying everyday life, and not just the objects and stuff, but how they lived and everything? How important is that to know? Anybody want to?
Well, go ahead.
From the standpoint of studying the story of the Underground Railroad, that's a missing piece that frequently people like to focus on routes and travel and buildings, and they're not asking questions. Well, what were the lives of the people who were participating, either as travelers or as hospitality providers and safety providers, and this is part of what is our constant attempt to explore, to try to figure out, what did they do, how did they live, who do they interact with, because you begin to see a different level of people involvement when you start looking at the story that way.
More levels of society, or
and also say Stephen and Harriet Myers lived in the house there at 194 or 198 Lumber Street, it would have been, and Thomas Elkins lived 3 or 4 doors down. They worked together, and so they're both part of the story, but we tend to, a lot of times, contemporarily tend to say, well, let's look at this house. It's like, it's not really the house. It's the story of the relationship between these people.
Okay. And Mike, what were we going to?
Oh, I would agree with Paul. I mean, it's about the community. And so if you branch out beyond just one particular house, you realize the story is really about the development of the community there. And then you can branch out into larger questions about what was going on at that time, in the 1850s and 40s.
Okay. And then
what happened afterwards.
And then you try to supplement that with written history.
Yeah, and then part of the problem too is with archaeology. I mean, you can find a lot about Abraham Tenbrook, right, in the historical record, but you can find very little about the enslaved people who lived on that property, or people who are coming through at the Myers residence trying to escape slavery. But you have this material record that speaks to those lives.
Okay.
And it's like Paul said, it's not just the people who are coming up from the South, but it's also that community, and it's that engagement that really matters.
So Marilyn, I'm not going to talk about some more. Was anything like really significant? What was the most significant find, if you could pick one or two? Or were they all kind of equal?
Well, it gets back to your earlier question.
Well, this is all everyday kind of stuff, right?
The answer, I mean, with respect to your earlier question, I mean, we are reconstructing wealth and health, and that is a comparative process. How did, and activities that were done, it gives a voice to the people, to the agents that were making their own decisions about their consumption patterns, their preferences, what they ate in terms of cow bone, marine shell, different kinds of decoration and clothing, and probably one of the most exciting finds for me was at Tenbrook when we found an ornament that was a reused piece of metal with perforations in it that Michael recognized as the type of handmade jewelry that enslaved persons used to make. And so that, and possibly another one from the Myers residence, but special objects like that really speak of, agency in defining your own social identity in this volatile time period in history.
And Paul, what can you, now that you've been doing this for so long, what can you say about the, how many escaped slaves, is escape the right word? How many slaves on the run, I guess, came through Albany? Do you know? Or?
Well, we can't say for sure. I'm sure it's in the thousands, but there are different records at different times that have identified a number. There's an 1842 document that suggests 350 people in that one year. There's the document of 1857 that talks about. I'm trying to remember the number. I think it was. I want to say 250.
Were there several places besides the Myers house in Albany?
The answer has to be yes.
Obviously, some must have been secret out there.
Well, that's part of what we've been trying to explore. We do have this document, which we call the Vigilance Committee Flyer, which identifies 198 Lumber Street as the headquarters for the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad, so the headquarters for the Underground Railroad. But, there are 12 or 13 people identified on that document by name who were involved in providing help and assistance to those who were escaping and making their way to freedom. Every one of their homes has a relevance in terms of understanding what was going on for the Underground Railroad. So many of those people are scattered around Arbor Hill where they lived. A couple of them live across town in other places. So there are lots of potential places that we can talk about. And I guess I would be remiss if I didn't mention as well that the place where many of these folks worshipped for church, which actually includes two different places of relevance. One, a Wesleyan Methodist church on 3rd Street, which is no longer there, and Israel African Methodist Episcopal Church on Hamilton Street. So those places have a role in this story as well.
Okay. And then when an escaped slave came, how long did they usually stay before they went on?
Well, since we don't have the records, I can't tell you that. But let me suggest. I mean, some people felt very comfortable and might be willing to stay for a longer period of time. There are some discussions in letters and things from Stephen Myers where he talks about referring people out to farmers in the countryside for work. There's the story, in fact, of Charles Nall, who is another story that crops up later, where he appears to remain in the region for a considerable amount of time, getting work in a couple of different places. And then there are other people who were nervous about being followed or perhaps a fear of being captured who just stayed for a night.
Oh, okay. And Mike, down at the New York State Museum, you were telling me before we started, you have several, 100,000 objects from similar sites like this?
Yeah, we have around 400,000 artifacts from Albany. So I think our total collection is around 3.5 million artifacts from New York State. So those include about 2 million from Manhattan. But just the Albany collection alone is between 400,000 and 500,000.
Okay.
So we've got a lot of collections that are comparative for this this time period from the 1850s and the late 19th century. And one of the things that Paul had just mentioned, part of what archaeologists do is they do comparative. You can do comparative analysis. So if you have an artifact collection from the Myers residence, you can compare it with other sites around the city. So you can start to piece together these ideas about how people were engaged with the community and start comparing that with the network that Paul's talking about, and really get an idea of how people were sort of not just engaging in the Underground Railroad, but engaging in the community at large.
Yeah,
and that's
right.
that's a big part of the story as well.
So it's like you're kind of like writing history backwards a little bit. You're trying to.
Yeah.
So
Well, we're working against the stereotypes of, there were enslaved persons and there were free blacks in the 19th century. But they're different people and different families with, different goals and strategies and wealth levels. And
well, I would say from the two places that you've been at, Tenbrook Mansion, which I guess you could say is the power couple house, I guess, and then the Myers place. What's the difference? Is there in the kind of things you find, or are they similar? Since one was obviously a richer, I guess is that the right term? Richer, more higher, upper class, I guess. Was there a difference in the kind of things you find, or?
it's a little early in the analysis
Okay.
to come out with a definitive statement, but my impression is that they're not that different.
Okay.
We dug very different kinds of deposits too,
Okay,
sort of much smaller tests at Tenbrook, but the same mix of possessions is present at both places, I would say, on the whole. The imports versus local materials, diversity of bottles. But do you have any?
Well, I mean, you're going to find probably the same types of material at either site for different time periods. So at Tenbrook, in the case of the outer kitchen that we dug, it was really, we're looking 1830 and earlier. Whereas at the Myers residence, it was mostly 1850 and later. So the time periods are, you have a completely different consumer culture at that time. But you're going to probably find the same thing if you look at the yard or like a trash pit or something from the Tenbrook house that dates to that time period. You're probably going to find the same thing as you would out because these objects are being circulated. I mean, that's the trick. And so it's not always just about the material things. It's about the context that you find them, and it's also about that space. It's not just about the little things, but it's also about the creation of, in the case of Tenbrook, the creation of that space. So you have the mansion, and then you have the outbuildings, and then you have the other spaces that African Americans were working in the gardens and so on. And those things are important to all put into the mix and of the story.
So you were there. This went on for about a month. Is this going to continue?
Yeah, it was 6 weeks, and
6 weeks.
We're hoping to do it again
Next summer. Okay. Well, very good. So I should mention that the Underground Railroad History Project, Paul, you could mention in March you're having a big conference. Is that?
Yeah, I'm not sure when as this program will be airing, but we usually have our conference in March. We're going to have it at the Albany Convention Center, kind of in conjunction with the New York State Council for Social Studies. And we're hoping to have some really, really dynamic speakers and workshops, and we certainly invite the general public.
Well, I read you started this 17 years ago because you couldn't find a conference on the subject, so you started your
Right.
life.
I mean, this is Albany. I mean, you think about the number of programs that come and go here at state government and various offices of state government, as well as not-for-profit organizations and whatnot. So the conference mode is very common, and so it sort of made sense that, hey, why can't we be empowered and do one on this subject, since we're looking to explore it. That it also gives us an opportunity to kind of structure the menu of offerings in a way that will help us in terms of what we're exploring too. So there are advantages to starting your own conference.
Okay, and then, so Marilyn, you said you're going to be back next summer probably at this site?
Hopefully, yeah, that's the plan.
And Mike, the State Museum will always be there probably. Right?
Yeah, the State Museum, we hope will always be there, yes.
What kind of things, other than stuff like this, do you guys do stuff all around the state also? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we have, part of our mission is we want to do outreach, so we have projects like this, but we also have collections projects. We have an upcoming exhibit on Fort Orange, which is the early 17th century Dutch fort that we just got the collection. And so we're going to be doing, so we do year-round exhibits and things like that as well as other small archaeology projects around the city. So.
Very good. So,
can I mention on October 21st, we're doing International Archaeology Day at the Myers Residence. So we're actually going to have Marilyn and Mike and others.
Okay, is that October 21st?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah. And it's from 1 to 5, and people should register in advance so we know what kind of snacks to get.
Okay.
They'll be talking about these artifacts and others, and also have an opportunity to do some research on these artifacts toward developing an exhibit.
Okay, get the finals. Well, thank you all for giving us some insight into archaeology. Not a subject that we probably look at every day. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time on Getting to Know You.